In the heart of Atlanta's Buckhead district, where magnolia trees cast shadows over pristine lawns and family secrets hide behind perfectly maintained facades, 34-year-old Marianne Washington stood frozen in her parents' kitchen doorway. What she witnessed in that moment would shatter 20 years of willful blindness and ignite a revolution that would either destroy her family or finally set them all free. Her nephews, 8-year-old Carter and 6-year-old Blake, sat at the polished oak dining table, silver forks gleaming as they cut into generous portions of her mother's famous lasagna. The aroma of basil and melted mozzarella filled the air, mixing with the sound of their satisfied chatter. But on the cold linoleum floor, cross-legged like forgotten afterthoughts, sat her own sons, 10-year-old Marcus and 7-year-old Caleb, methodically eating peanut butter sandwiches from paper plates, their eyes downcast. Accustomed to this hierarchy they'd never questioned. How long have I been blind to this? The thought struck Marianne like lightning, illuminating years of subtle slights, excuses, and her own desperate need to believe in her family's love. In Atlanta's social circles, where appearances matter and family reputation can make or break business relationships, the Washington family had always presented a united front. Behind closed doors, however, favoritism had grown like kudzu, choking out fairness until only cruelty remained. This wasn't just about a meal. This was about 20 years of being the reliable daughter while her sister Deanna played the beloved princess. This was about $140,000 in loans that became gifts when Deanna needed them, but remained debts when Marianne struggled. This was about watching her biracial children, products of her marriage to her college sweetheart Jerome, a man whose dark skin had never quite earned her parents' full approval, being relegated to second-class status in their own grandparents' home. What Marianne didn't know, as she stood there trembling with a rage she'd suppressed for decades, was that this moment would become the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose hidden racism, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse spanning generations. She didn't know that her decision to finally say enough would lead to threats, manipulation, and attempts to destroy her marriage. But she also didn't know that this breaking point would ultimately become the foundation for something beautiful. A family rebuilt on respect, honesty, and genuine love rather than obligation and fear. The story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman's fight against favoritism. It's about the courage to set boundaries when everyone calls you selfish, the strength to expose truth when lies are more comfortable, and the wisdom to know that sometimes love means walking away until people are ready to love you properly. In a city where heritage and tradition often clash with progress and change, Marianne Washington was about to discover that the most revolutionary act isn't fighting the system. It's refusing to participate in your own oppression. Growing up in the Washington household meant understanding your place in an unspoken hierarchy, and Marianne had learned early that hers was always second. While Deanna received ballet lessons and piano recitals in their Druid Hills home, Marianne got practical gifts and lectures about responsibility. When Deanna brought home C's, their parents celebrated her artistic spirit. When Marianne brought home A's, she was reminded that intelligence meant nothing without character, a character apparently measured by how much she could sacrifice for others. The pattern had crystallized during their teenage years. Deanna's Sweet 16 party had been the talk of their social circle, a lavish affair in the ballroom of the Georgian Terrace Hotel, complete with a live band and custom dress that cost more than most people's cars. Marianne's 16th birthday had been a quiet dinner at home, followed by her parents' gentle suggestion that she might consider getting a part-time job to build character and learn the value of money. I should have seen it then, Marianne thought, remembering how she'd convinced herself that her parents' different treatment stemmed from their personalities. Deanna was the free spirit who needed nurturing, while she was the dependable one who could handle anything. It was a narrative that had served everyone well, except her. When Marianne married Jerome after college, the subtle disapproval had been carefully masked behind Southern politeness. Her parents attended the wedding, smiled for photos, and welcomed Jerome with the kind of warm superficiality that Atlanta's old families had perfected over generations. But there were signs. The way her mother's friends always asked about how Jerome was adjusting to their family, as if integration were a temporary condition rather than permanent union. The way her father spoke a little louder and slower when addressing Jerome, despite his Harvard MBA and executive position at Delta Airlines. The arrival of Marcus and Caleb had initially seemed to bridge these gaps. Her parents doted on their grandsons with apparent genuine affection, hosting birthday parties and buying generous Christmas gifts. But even then, Marianne had noticed subtle differences. How Deanna's boys received the premium gifts while hers got practical presents. How family photos were arranged with careful attention to positioning. How stories about the grandchildren somehow always centered on Carter and Blake's achievements while treating Marcus and Caleb's successes as pleasant footnotes. For years, Marianne had made excuses. Her parents were from a different generation. They meant well. Family harmony was more important than perfect equality. She'd convinced herself that love came in different forms, and perhaps her parents simply expressed affection differently toward different grandchildren. After all, they'd never said anything explicitly racist, never used slurs or made overt comments about her children's mixed heritage. But standing in that kitchen doorway, watching her sons accept their inferior treatment as normal, Marianne felt 20 years of rationalization crumble like sand. This wasn't about different love languages or generational gaps. This was systematic devaluation, and her children were learning to accept it as their due. How many times had Marcus come home asking why Grandma always seemed happier to see Carter? How many times had Caleb wondered why his drawings never made it onto the refrigerator, while his cousin's artwork received prominent display? The questions that had once seemed like childhood confusion now rang with heartbreaking clarity. The confrontation began quietly, as most family explosions do. Marianne calmly asked her mother, Patricia, why the children were eating different meals. The response was a masterclass in gaslighting wrapped in Southern charm. "Oh, honey, the boys said they preferred sandwiches today. You know how picky children can be." The casual dismissal, delivered while Patricia continued folding laundry as if nothing significant had happened, ignited something primal in Marianne's chest. "That's interesting, Mom, because I've never known Marcus to prefer a cold sandwich over lasagna." Marianne's voice carried the controlled tension of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of swallowing anger. She watched her mother's face carefully, noting the slight tightening around the eyes that had always signaled Patricia's displeasure at being questioned. Patricia's response revealed years of practiced manipulation. She launched into a familiar litany about how difficult it was to manage 4 grandchildren, how different children had different needs, and how ungrateful it was for Marianne to question her grandmother's judgment after all these years of help. The words were carefully chosen arrows designed to trigger guilt and doubt, weapons Patricia had been sharpening since Marianne's childhood. But something had shifted in Marianne during those moments in the doorway. The daughter who had always apologized and backed down was replaced by a mother whose protective instincts had finally overpowered her conditioning. She looked at her boys, still sitting on the floor, watching this adult conversation with the careful attention children develop when they're used to being affected by dynamics they don't understand. "Marcus, Caleb, go wash your hands and get your backpacks. We're leaving." The quiet authority in her voice surprised even her. As her sons scrambled to obey, Marianne turned back to her mother with newfound clarity. "This stops today. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing by treating my children differently, but it ends now." The drive home was quiet except for Marcus's tentative question from the back seat. "Mom, are you mad at Grandma?" The innocence in his voice nearly broke her heart. How could she explain that she wasn't mad? She was awake? That sometimes love requires protecting people from those who claim to love them? Instead, she promised her sons that things were going to change, that they deserved to be treated with the same respect and love as anyone else in the family. That evening, after Jerome came home from work and the boys were asleep, Marianne found herself in their home office, staring at bank statements and canceled checks. The evidence of her financial relationship with her parents sprawled across the desk like crime scene photos. 20 years of loans that had funded Deanna's lifestyle, while Marianne's requests for help came with lectures about fiscal responsibility. Money for Deanna's failed boutique business, her divorce attorney, her children's private school tuition, all gifts disguised as family support. Meanwhile, the $5,000 Marianne had borrowed during Jerome's brief unemployment had been tracked with banker-like precision, complete with a payment schedule and gentle reminders about compound interest. The numbers told a story that words had always obscured, with $147,000 in financial support flowing to Deanna over 2 decades, while Marianne had received $8,000 total, money she'd repaid within 18 months. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about what the money represented: worthiness, love, and the unspoken belief that some family members deserved support, while others deserved lectures about self-reliance. As she organized the evidence of this decades-long inequality, Marianne felt something she'd never experienced before: the righteous anger of someone who'd finally stopped gaslighting herself. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of setting boundaries, not knowing that her family would interpret her newfound self-respect as an act of war. The phone call came 3 days later, just as Marianne was serving breakfast to her boys. Patricia's voice carried the practiced, wounded tone of a mother whose authority had been questioned. "Marianne, honey, we need to talk about what happened the other day. I think you misunderstood the situation, and I'm concerned about the message you're sending the children about family respect." The conversation that followed was a textbook example of emotional manipulation disguised as concern. Patricia painted herself as the misunderstood grandmother whose only crime was loving all her grandchildren differently but equally. She suggested that Marianne was being oversensitive, possibly influenced by outside forces. A barely veiled reference to Jerome that made Marianne's blood pressure spike. The implication was clear. A good daughter wouldn't question her mother's judgment, and certainly wouldn't create conflict over something as trivial as seating arrangements. But Marianne had spent 3 sleepless nights reading articles about family dynamics, toxic patterns, and the long-term effects of favoritism on children. She'd watched her sons more carefully, noticing how they automatically assumed they'd receive less attention, fewer treats, smaller portions. The learned helplessness was heartbreaking. They'd been conditioned to expect inequality as normal. "Mom, I need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once," Marianne interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The way you treat my children compared to Deanna's children is unacceptable. It stops now or our visits stop. This isn't a negotiation." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Marianne wondered if the call had dropped. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice had transformed from wounded mother to cold matriarch. "I see. Well, I suppose Jerome's influence is finally showing. I'd hoped our family values were stronger than outside pressures. But apparently, I was wrong." The racist undertone wasn't subtle anymore. Patricia had dropped the pretense of colorblind love and revealed the ugly truth that had always lurked beneath surface pleasantries. For the first time in their relationship, Marianne heard her mother's true feelings about her marriage, her children, and her choices. The mask of Southern politeness had slipped, revealing the prejudice that had shaped 20 years of subtle mistreatment. Marianne's response was calm and final. "You're right about one thing, Mom. Our family values are showing. The difference is, I'm choosing values that include respect for all children, not just the ones who meet your approval." She hung up before Patricia could respond, her hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt remarkably like freedom. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Within hours, Deanna called with tears and accusations. How could Marianne be so cruel to their elderly parents? Didn't she understand that stress could trigger their father's heart condition? The family was falling apart. And it was all Marianne's fault for making mountains out of molehills and poisoning family relationships with her unreasonable demands. The campaign was coordinated and relentless. Extended family members called with concerned questions about Marianne's recent behavior. Church friends mentioned hearing that she was going through a difficult time and offered prayers for family healing. The message was clear. Marianne was the problem, the ungrateful daughter who'd forgotten her place and was destroying family harmony with selfish demands. But something remarkable happened as the pressure mounted. Jerome, who'd always encouraged Marianne to maintain family peace, surprised her with his unwavering support. "I've watched you sacrifice your self-respect for their approval for 20 years, he said that night, holding her as she cried angry tears. "I'm proud of you for finally putting our children first." His validation felt like sunlight after decades of shadows, reminding her that healthy love doesn't require self-erasure. For the first time in her adult life, Marianne wasn't fighting this battle alone, and the strength of that partnership would prove crucial in the storms ahead. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Marianne discovered that her family's manipulation had escalated beyond emotional pressure into outright sabotage. The revelation came through her friend Sarah, whose husband worked with Jerome at Delta Airlines. Over coffee in a Midtown cafe, Sarah hesitantly shared disturbing news. Someone had been calling Jerome's workplace, claiming to be a concerned family member reporting erratic behavior and marriage problems that might affect his job performance. The accusations were carefully crafted to sound plausible without being provably false. Anonymous callers suggested that Jerome was under unusual stress at home, that there were concerning developments in his personal life that colleagues should be aware of. In corporate America, where reputation matters enormously, such whispers could destroy careers through innuendo alone. Marianne felt sick as the implications sank in. Her family wasn't just trying to pressure her into compliance. They were actively attempting to destroy her marriage and financial stability. The sophistication of the attack suggested coordination between Patricia and Deanna, possibly with input from their extended social network. This wasn't just wounded feelings or generational misunderstanding. This was warfare disguised as family concern. Jerome's reaction was swift and decisive. He immediately contacted his HR department to report the harassment, documenting the timeline and requesting that any future calls be referred to legal counsel. His supervisor, who'd worked with Jerome for 8 years, was appalled by the situation and assured him that his job performance spoke louder than anonymous accusations. But the damage to trust was real. How could they maintain relationships with people willing to threaten their livelihood over hurt feelings? That evening, Marianne made a decision that would define the next chapter of their lives. She gathered every piece of evidence documenting her family's financial favoritism, every email and text message showing the pattern of manipulation, and every recording of recent phone conversations where racial undertones had become explicit. She wasn't just protecting her immediate family anymore. She was building a case that would prevent future manipulation attempts. The recordings were particularly revealing. Georgia's one-party consent law meant that Marianne could legally record phone conversations without the other party's knowledge. When Patricia called to discuss reconciliation, her words painted a clear picture of underlying racism. She spoke about maintaining family traditions, about children who were easier to relate to, and about concerns that Marcus and Caleb were becoming difficult and influenced by attitudes that didn't fit family values. Deanna's recorded conversations were even more damaging. Without Patricia's careful political vocabulary, she spoke bluntly about feeling displaced by Jerome's boys and wondering why their parents couldn't see that favoritism toward Carter and Blake was simply natural preference for grandchildren who really felt like family. The casual cruelty was breathtaking. 2 little boys dismissed as outsiders in their own grandparents' home simply because of their biracial heritage. Armed with this evidence, Marianne felt the power dynamic shift. Her family had operated in shadows, using plausible deniability and gaslighting to maintain their behavior while portraying themselves as victims of her oversensitivity. But recorded truth had a way of cutting through manipulative narratives. For the first time since childhood, Marianne held cards her family couldn't see or counter. The strategic advantage gave her something she'd never possessed in family conflicts: leverage. She wasn't the desperate daughter begging for equal treatment anymore. She was a woman with evidence of financial exploitation, emotional abuse, and racist treatment of her children. The question was no longer whether she could prove her case. It was whether her family was prepared for the consequences of their actions becoming public in their reputation-conscious Atlanta social circles. As she organized her evidence files, Marianne realized that this documentation process had given her something beyond legal protection. It had given her clarity about patterns she'd spent decades minimizing and excusing. The objective evidence didn't lie or gaslight or make her question her perceptions. It simply showed the truth. Her family had treated her and her children as second-class members for 20 years, and when challenged, they'd escalated to attempting sabotage rather than examining their behavior. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones keeping you smallest, she thought, finally understanding that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their abuse.
If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it.
3 months after cutting financial ties with her parents, Marianne watched their carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The first sign was Deanna's panicked phone call in late October, her usual entitlement replaced by genuine fear. Without Marianne's steady financial support, the family's economic house of cards was collapsing. Patricia's medical bills, previously subsidized by Marianne's loans, had piled into serious debt. Deanna's boutique, kept afloat by her parents' financial gifts, faced immediate closure without continued funding. "You can't just abandon family when things get difficult," Deanna pleaded, her voice breaking with unprecedented vulnerability. But Marianne recognized the manipulation beneath the tears. This wasn't genuine remorse for years of mistreatment. It was desperation disguised as emotional appeal. The same people who'd threatened her marriage and career were now demanding rescue from consequences they'd created through their own poor financial decisions. The revelation of their true financial situation was staggering. Patricia and Robert had been living beyond their means for years, maintaining their Buckhead lifestyle through a combination of credit debt and Marianne's supplemental support. They'd assumed their reliable daughter would always be available to cover shortfalls, never considering that their behavior might eventually cost them their most dependable source of help. Watching her family scramble to restructure their finances without her, Marianne felt an unexpected emotion: pity mixed with clarity. She could see now how her enabling had prevented them from learning basic adult skills like living within their means and treating people with respect. By always rescuing them from consequences, she'd robbed them of opportunities to grow and change. Jerome found her in their garden one evening, staring at her phone after another desperate call from Deanna. "Do you regret it?" he asked gently, settling beside her on their porch swing. The question she'd been avoiding hung between them like autumn mist. Did she regret protecting her children's dignity? Did she regret refusing to fund her own emotional abuse? Did she regret finally valuing herself enough to demand better treatment? "I regret that it took me so long," she answered honestly. "I regret that Marcus and Caleb had to experience years of systematic devaluation because I was too afraid to rock the boat. I regret that I thought love meant accepting cruelty and calling it family." The holidays approached with unprecedented peace in the Washington household. For the first time in their marriage, Jerome and Marianne didn't navigate the complex emotional minefield of divided family loyalties. There were no tense dinners where their children received subtly inferior treatment, no careful political conversations designed to avoid triggering Patricia's disapproval, no exhausting emotional labor required to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally didn't respect them. Marcus and Caleb, initially confused by the absence of grandparent visits, gradually blossomed in the space created by removing toxic dynamics. Their natural confidence emerged without the constant subtle message that they were somehow less worthy than their cousins. They stopped asking questions about why some grandchildren received better treatment, stopped automatically assuming they'd get smaller portions or lesser gifts. But perhaps most surprisingly, Marianne discovered that removing her parents' manipulation had strengthened other family relationships. Her uncle David, Patricia's brother, reached out privately to express support for her decision. He'd watched the favoritism for years, he admitted, but felt powerless to intervene in his sister's parenting choices. Several family friends quietly acknowledged that they'd noticed the differential treatment, but hadn't known how to address it appropriately. The isolation Marianne had feared, the loss of extended family and social connections, proved largely imaginary. People who genuinely cared about her respected her decision to protect her children, while those who criticized her choice revealed their own willingness to prioritize comfort over justice. The sorting process was painful but clarifying. She discovered who actually supported her family's well-being versus who simply wanted her to maintain convenient emotional labor. As winter settled over Atlanta, Marianne realized that setting boundaries hadn't just protected her children from immediate harm. It had created space for authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and fear. Freedom isn't just about escaping bad situations, she reflected. It's about creating room for good ones to grow. The breaking point arrived on a cold February morning when Patricia collapsed during a routine grocery trip, triggering a minor heart episode that landed her in Piedmont Hospital's cardiac unit. The call came from Robert, his voice shaky with fear and barely concealed expectation. Surely this medical emergency would bring Marianne running back to fulfill her daughter duties, forgetting months of boundary setting in the face of family crisis. For a moment, standing in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, Marianne felt the familiar pull of conditioning. The dutiful daughter part of her brain immediately began calculating how to rearrange her schedule, how to manage her children's care while rushing to her mother's bedside, how to temporarily set aside her hurt feelings for the sake of family emergency. It was a response programmed by decades of being the reliable one, the caretaker, the daughter whose own needs always came second. But then she looked at Marcus and Caleb eating breakfast at their kitchen table, secure in the knowledge that they were valued and loved unconditionally in their own home. She thought about the recorded conversations where Patricia had dismissed her grandsons as not quite family, about the systematic financial exploitation, about the attempts to sabotage Jerome's career. Emergency didn't erase abuse. It simply tested whether boundaries would hold under pressure. "I'm sorry to hear about Mom's health scare," Marianne said carefully. "I hope the doctors can help her recover quickly. However, given the circumstances of our relationship, I won't be visiting the hospital or resuming financial support." The words felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd never learned fluently. But they also felt true in a way that years of obligatory family performance never had. Robert's response revealed the depth of their entitlement. Outrage that any daughter could prioritize petty disagreements over her mother's health, accusations that Marianne had become cold and selfish, threats that she'd regret this decision when it was too late to make amends. The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to trigger guilt and fear about missing a final opportunity for reconciliation. But Marianne had learned to recognize manipulation dressed as emergency. Patricia's condition, while concerning, was stable and treatable. Her parents had world-class medical insurance and access to excellent health care. They had Deanna and extended family members available for support. What they didn't have was automatic access to Marianne's emotional and financial labor, simply because a crisis had occurred. The next few weeks brought a relentless campaign of pressure from extended family, church members, and family friends. How could Marianne be so heartless? What would people think about a daughter who abandoned her mother during a health crisis? The social pressure was intense in their tight-knit Atlanta community, where family reputation mattered enormously, and public estrangement reflected poorly on everyone involved. Jerome found her crying in their bathroom one evening after a particularly brutal phone call from her cousin, questioning her Christian values and family loyalty. "I feel like I'm crazy," she whispered. "Everyone's acting like I'm the monster for refusing to accept mistreatment. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe family means accepting people as they are, regardless of how they treat you." "Look at me," Jerome said, lifting her face gently. "People who love you don't systematically devalue your children. They don't try to destroy your marriage when you ask for basic respect. They don't demand your money while treating you like a second-class family member. You're not crazy for recognizing abuse, even when it comes wrapped in family packaging." His words provided anchor in the storm of social pressure and self-doubt. Marianne realized that her community's criticism said more about their comfort with dysfunction than about her decision to protect her family. In a culture that often prioritized family harmony over individual well-being, her boundary setting was being interpreted as selfish rebellion rather than healthy self-preservation. But slowly, quietly, other voices began reaching out. Women who'd struggled with similar family dynamics, friends who'd watched her sacrifice herself for years and secretly admired her courage to finally say enough. A support network emerged that she'd never known existed. People who understood that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's harmful behavior until they choose to change. Setting boundaries doesn't make you the villain, Marianne realized. It makes you visible to the people who've been waiting for you to value yourself enough to demand better. For the first time in her life, she was discovering what it felt like to be supported for her strength rather than valued for her willingness to endure. The transformation in Marianne's immediate family was remarkable to witness as spring arrived in Atlanta. Without the constant stress of managing toxic family dynamics, their home became a haven of authentic connection and mutual respect. Jerome, freed from the burden of watching his wife systematically devalue herself to maintain impossible family peace, rediscovered the confident woman he'd married. Their marriage deepened as they faced this crisis as true partners rather than co-managers of everyone else's emotions. Marcus and Caleb blossomed in ways that broke Marianne's heart for what they'd endured and filled it with hope for their future. Marcus, now 11, began speaking up for himself at school and home with newfound confidence. His teachers noticed increased participation in class discussions and better relationships with peers. Caleb, always the more sensitive child, stopped asking the heartbreaking questions about why some grandchildren were loved differently. Their natural personalities emerged without the overlay of learned helplessness and acceptance of inequality. The financial freedom was equally transformative. Without the steady drain of supporting her parents' lifestyle and Deanna's poor decisions, Marianne and Jerome could focus on their own family's goals. They started a college fund for the boys, planned the kitchen renovation they'd postponed for years, and began seriously discussing Jerome's dream of starting his own consulting firm. Money that had disappeared into the black hole of family obligation was now available for building their own future. But perhaps most significantly, Marianne discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for decades. Without the constant emotional labor of managing her family's dysfunction, she had energy for her own interests and goals. She enrolled in the graduate program she'd deferred when Deanna needed emergency financial help. She joined a book club, started volunteering at the boys' school, and reconnected with friends she'd neglected during years of crisis management for her extended family. The contrast was striking when she compared her current life to the exhausting cycle of drama and rescue that had defined previous years. She'd lived in constant low-level anxiety, always anticipating the next crisis that would require her emotional or financial intervention. Now, her phone calls weren't dreaded interruptions, but genuine connections with people who respected her boundaries and valued her well-being. Her relationship with her children evolved too. Without modeling the acceptance of mistreatment as family loyalty, she was teaching Marcus and Caleb different lessons about love and respect. They watched their mother stand up for their dignity and learned that healthy relationships required mutual consideration. They saw their father support their mother's difficult decision and understood that true partnership meant protecting each other's well-being even when outside pressure demanded otherwise. One evening in May, as she watched Jerome help the boys with homework while she prepared dinner, Marianne felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they'd built together. The kitchen was filled with laughter and natural conversation, free from the tension that had always accompanied visits to or from her parents. This was what family was supposed to feel like: safe, supportive, and genuinely loving rather than obligatory and conditional. The irony wasn't lost on her that by leaving her family of origin, she'd discovered what healthy family actually looked like. The contrast illuminated just how much dysfunction she'd normalized over the years. Love didn't require constant sacrifice of self-worth. Respect wasn't something she needed to earn through perfect behavior and endless giving. Support flowed both ways in healthy relationships rather than moving unidirectionally from her to everyone else. Friends began commenting on the change in her demeanor. She looked lighter, they said, more present in conversations and less distracted by underlying stress. The permanent furrow between her brows had relaxed. Her laugh came more easily. She'd regained a sense of herself as someone worthy of love and respect, rather than someone whose value was measured by her usefulness to others. This is what I was protecting by setting boundaries, she realized. Not just my children's dignity, but our family's capacity for genuine joy and connection. The space created by removing toxic relationships had allowed healthy ones to flourish in ways she'd never imagined possible. The call came on a humid August evening as Marianne was reading bedtime stories to Caleb. Robert's voice was different this time, quieter, stripped of the righteous indignation that had characterized their previous conversations. Patricia was in the hospital again, he said, but this wasn't about demanding Marianne's immediate presence. This was something else entirely, a request for conversation, not capitulation. Your mother's been talking, Robert continued, his words careful and deliberate, about things she's done, things she's said. She wants to try to understand what went wrong. The vulnerability in his voice was unprecedented. For the first time in their relationship, her father sounded like someone seeking connection rather than compliance. Marianne's initial reaction was skeptical caution. How many times had her parents expressed seeming remorse only to revert to old patterns once she'd lowered her guard? But something in Robert's tone suggested this might be different. He wasn't making demands or setting conditions. He wasn't threatening consequences or using Patricia's health as leverage. He was simply asking if she'd be willing to have a conversation about rebuilding their relationship on healthier terms. After discussing it with Jerome and sleeping on the decision, Marianne agreed to meet with a family therapist. Neutral ground where conversations could be facilitated and patterns could be examined objectively. She entered the first session 6 months later with clear boundaries. Any relationship going forward would require acknowledgement of past harm, commitment to equal treatment of all grandchildren, and respect for her parenting decisions and marriage. What unfolded over several months of therapy was painful, revealing, and ultimately hopeful. Patricia's breakdown in the therapist's office wasn't performative manipulation, but genuine recognition of the damage she'd caused. Decades of buried prejudice, social pressure to maintain family image, and her own childhood wounds had created patterns she'd never examined. She'd treated Deanna as the easy daughter who needed protection while casting Marianne as the strong one who could handle anything, a dynamic that had poisoned both relationships. The process wasn't linear or simple. There were sessions where old defensive patterns emerged, where Patricia reverted to victim positioning, where Robert struggled to see his own enabling behavior, but there were also breakthrough moments of genuine accountability and recognition. When Patricia finally said, "I treated your children differently because they reminded me that my daughter had chosen a life I didn't understand, and I punished them for my own discomfort," the truth felt like sunlight breaking through decades of clouds. Deanna's participation was more complicated. Initially resistant to therapy and convinced that Marianne was being dramatic, she gradually began recognizing how the family's dysfunction had damaged her too. Being the favored child had robbed her of opportunities to develop resilience and real self-worth. Her relationships were shallow because she'd never learned to function without special treatment. The financial support that seemed like love had actually prevented her from developing adult capabilities. The most powerful session came when they brought Marcus and Caleb to meet with the therapist alongside Patricia and Robert. Watching her parents really see their grandsons, not as extensions of her choices they disapproved of, but as individual children with their own personalities, dreams, and inherent worth, was transformative for everyone involved. Marcus's quiet question, "Grandma, why didn't you like us before?" led to the most honest conversation their family had ever had. Recovery wasn't instant or complete. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. But by Christmas of that year, they were able to share a meal together. One where all the children sat at the same table, ate the same food, and received equal attention and affection. Patricia had to consciously work against decades of ingrained patterns, but the effort was genuine and visible. The financial boundaries remained firm. Marianne never resumed supporting her parents or sister financially, and they learned to live within their means. But emotional connection gradually returned, based on mutual respect rather than obligation and manipulation. It wasn't the same relationship they'd had before. It was better, because it was honest. Sometimes love means walking away until people are ready to love you properly. Marianne reflected, watching her boys play with their cousins while the adults managed actual adult conversation. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they decide you're worth the work of becoming better people. The family that emerged from this crisis bore little resemblance to the one that had caused it, and for the first time in her life, Marianne felt like she truly belonged in it. 3 years later, Marianne Washington stood in her parents' backyard during Marcus's 13th birthday party, watching a scene that would have been impossible before their family's reckoning. All 4 grandchildren played together as equals, their laughter mixing with the sounds of adult conversation that flowed naturally, rather than carefully. Patricia and Robert treated their grandsons with the same attention and affection they'd always shown Carter and Blake, not because they were performing for Marianne's approval, but because they genuinely learned to see all their grandchildren as equally precious. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It required Patricia to confront uncomfortable truths about her own prejudices and the way social pressure had shaped her treatment of her biracial grandsons. It required Robert to acknowledge his role in enabling harmful patterns rather than addressing them. It required Deanna to develop genuine relationships with her nephews instead of seeing them as competition for family resources. Most importantly, it required everyone to accept that Marianne's boundaries weren't punishments, but necessary guardrails for healthy relationships. The lessons learned extended far beyond their family circle. Marianne's story became a quiet inspiration in their Atlanta community, where other women struggling with similar family dynamics found courage in her example. She'd learned to distinguish between healthy compromise and harmful accommodation, between loving someone and enabling their dysfunction. The difference, she discovered, lay in whether relationships moved toward mutual respect or perpetuated harmful patterns. Jerome's consulting firm had thrived, partly because their marriage was stronger when both partners felt valued and supported. Marcus was becoming a confident young man who understood his worth wasn't negotiable, while Caleb's sensitive nature was now nurtured rather than exploited. The children had learned to expect respect as a baseline rather than something to be grateful for when occasionally received. Perhaps most importantly, Marianne had discovered that setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was the most loving thing she could have done for everyone involved. By refusing to enable dysfunction, she'd created space for her family to become healthier versions of themselves. By protecting her children's dignity, she'd taught them that love requires respect. By valuing herself enough to demand better treatment, she'd shown them what healthy relationships look like. The journey from that devastating moment in her parents' kitchen to this joyful birthday celebration had taught her that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones keeping you smallest. But it had also taught her that genuine transformation is possible when people are willing to do the hard work of examining their behavior and choosing to change. As she watched her sons blow out birthday candles surrounded by family members who now truly saw and valued them, Marianne felt profound gratitude for the courage she'd found to say, "Enough." The price of peace had been too high when it required sacrificing her children's dignity and her own self-worth. The price of change had been temporary discomfort in exchange for lasting respect and authentic love. What patterns in your own life might need the courage to say enough? And what authentic relationships might be waiting to flourish if you created space for them by removing toxic ones?
Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, If you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.